you've obviously been doing this with your students for many years. You've been inviting them to create their own Mystery, usually over a semester. Is that right?
Right.
And then
That's right.
And what do they do? What do they do with it? Is it just an accounting of themselves, or are they asked to do a creative project with it?
Well, so they, and I'll have to send some links. I have, both graduate students and undergraduates have done this for, especially the undergraduates have done it for a couple of decades. I've done my own, you can look at that. But I teach it I use it in the context of a course I call hypermedia. That's not good. And we use this textbook. I wrote this textbook. This is a full account of the creation of a Mystery, an image-wide scope. Internet invention was generated out of this hypermedia class. And as I say, I use it as the justification of using the Mystery. As I say, it's a pedagogy for electracy. I mean, the idea is that this is the kind of learning that's more electrate, using image thinking, moving beyond, not giving up on literacy or orality, but rather folding those into this larger image, emotional, affective, sensory, aesthetic kind of thinking. And the idea is that there's a kind of a nice match between the levels of the apparatus in electracy. So you have digital imaging technologies, that's specifically hypermedia, the name of this course, and they have this kind of linking, networked, distributional, kind of associative way of organizing information and expression, which has a nice match with accounts of how creativity works. So dream work or lateral thinking. When you read descriptions of that kind of how to generate ideas, kind of free, browsing, low focus kind of thinking, it matches up very well. The description's like, oh, that sounds a lot like a hypermedia network. And the stories of Ted Nelson, the inventor of the idea of hypertext back in the 60s. He said his mind was all over the place. He had this kind of free-floating, associative mind. And he said, why isn't there something like this, that has a sort of network associational support for the kind of way I think, instead of always kind of narrowly focused, analytical, propositional, sequential reasoning. So it's a kind of thinking that's supported very well between creativity and the media. So that's the way I teach this hypermedia course. To say, well, look, given that there is this sort of thinking and matches very well with the technology, let's do a course in hypermedia where we actually use this type of creative logic. And that's sort of the rationale for it. And then we go through the Mystery, so we'll get an experience of it. It's not that electric thinking, it's not that this sort of image logic is confined to autobiographical work or mystoriographical work at all. It's just that that's a really good setting to introduce it, in that context. And then you can move it into other concerns, that we might call post-analytical or, post-empirical situations to get at this other dimension of human reality, both, collectively and individually, this sort of emotional or affective part that our empirical consultants kind of leave out, from the equation when they're trying to address world problems or policy problems. So it's in that context. But the idea is always, the unexamined life is not worth living. So it makes a lot of sense to teach Mystery in the context of the humanities. But I teach it as more like, all right, there's that justification. It's a really good way to learn, really almost anything. To support more analytical kinds of learning, but in this larger sense that it's a kind of thinking that goes on in the world, and that there's a way to do it right, and there's a way to do it well, and let's practice that and use it, take it over to situations. So that's the justification. Creativity is a way to teach creativity. It's a way to teach new media, logics. As well as addressing the unexamined life issue.
Just before you spoke, I presented a couple of architects. One of them, Tom Main, whose work I've shown you a little bit of. And I remember when we went to talk with Tom, he talked about. He admitted he was very influenced by the avant-garde as as a very young person. And obviously that's probably later than his 5-year-old childhood or something. But and then when he, in his adult life, the aporia, if you will, in our discipline, sort of late modernism couldn't figure out how to bypass the kind of sterility of what it was producing. It was very postmodernism emerged as a sort of semantic crutch, if you will, which he abhorred, having been influenced by the surrealists. And it kind of, you can sort of see him working through this as a form of what Dante is called sort of creative autobiography. That it's almost like he's using his dispositive into the breach of opportunity, and he begins to articulate an opportunity for a new architecture which comes to fruition in the fullness of his career. And now it's kind of, we look at it and we forget where it came from. It's just kind of Tom's stuff, but in fact it was kind of invented and instigated at some point out of his own personal drives. And I think it's very interesting. You're going to send me off trying to think of my own Mysteriography, and you do it hesitantly because you know it's not a normal thing that you're called upon to do. And I certainly think, in the context of our department, I doubt anyone's been asked to reflect in this kind of way as a kind of to balance out the craft learning, as you say, with the kind of personal drives and. So I welcome it. I think it's a fascinating sort of provocation and an offering. I don't know what anyone else has questions while it's here. And I'd love to encourage some of this, in fact. Again, I'd love to do. Have you ever done a mini Mysteriography where it's short? I imagine if you do it too quickly, then it ends up as it can easily become facile. Sort of superficial memories are invoked, and you almost press them into service too quickly.
Well, I have done workshops with people. I think I mentioned with Cranbrook that when Kim Tanzer used to be at University of Florida, now she's dean at Virginia School of Architecture, but she ran a Cranbrook session. This would have been a long time ago, but we did a workshop. It was a day-long workshop with architects. Because you go and you get credentials, and you have to go back and get some coursework or something. And these were career architects. They were professionals. They weren't educators or whatever, and some were probably, but they were very skeptical. Kind of laid out this thing, and I was working with a colleague in architecture named Bill Tilson at the time. He and I were doing it together. They were pretty skeptical, but we just said, well, let's just go through, let's see. Will you find a pattern? And of course, many of my students were skeptical too. I don't have a pattern, or my life, a lot of times it's like, my life was just so uninteresting, nothing, I didn't do anything. But it turns out, whatever you got to work with, right, is your imagination, you got what you got, and it's going to format it in some way. It doesn't matter whether it's with a skateboard or, taking the subway in New York. I mean, it's in there. And so we just said, well, just give it a try. And this is creativity, right? Suspend your disbelief and just, let's try it. And and I'm telling you, there were a lot of converts in that sense, like, whoa, there's a pattern there. And we're sure in a short amount of time, half a day or a day, what exactly they might do with it. But the point is that they did see the pattern. And the other thing that happens, this especially in effect happens whether you're working with professionals in the workshop or with graduate students. We always do it more quickly with grad students so we can go on to get to other questions. With the undergrads, they spend the whole semester on it. But they discover, so the grad students are already deep into some, question for their dissertation or so their advanced research. And they discovered, they thought their interest in this, whatever it was, started maybe in late undergraduate or, in their 20s or something. They discovered it goes a lot further, into their much younger days, that there are things that were already a part of their imaginative world that turn out to be, making a big part of their decisions that they're making more intellectually. Underneath that is this other source of decision making, like you said, this disposition, this certain way we want things to be. Not in a sense of willing it consciously, but intuitively, we want things to be stacked, or we want there to be a principle, or we want things to move in a certain way. And there's kind of a fantasy dimension to this as well. Again, not a fully worked out explicit thing. But so it can definitely be done in short order. I mean, I went through the Syndac thing to identify the parts, and really what I have in mind here is that any of you could try this just in your journals. I know you all keep creating journals of some kind, and you could just think about this and just in a superficial way if you like. But sometimes people get hung up on, well, should I use this memory? Should I use that memory? But the idea of the wide image is that all roads lead to Rome, right? I mean, so, because the argument is, and I'm telling you, it's demonstrated in hundreds of cases, and that is that there's only 4 or 5 images in your imagination. I mean, and we know anyway the limits of human intelligence, like, really, like I say, you can't get past 7. The human memory just can't, in terms of the living brain, we can deal with like a pattern of 3 and 4, get 7, and that's it. After that, it's mini. 1, 2, 3, mini is the way they used to count. So in terms of just the raw or living intelligence, there's this 4 or 5 pattern, 4 or 5 images, in various variations. So, whatever you come up with, it's going to be good. But the idea is just that there has to be an authenticity to the process. So you say, well, the only time I ever had a student who wasn't able to do it, actually dropped out, was a young man, pretty cynical, I guess, kid, and came to me at midterm and said, I thought this was baloney, and so I tried to fake it. I was making up stuff. I was just going to show you at the end of it. I just made it all up. I said, it's way too hard. It's way too hard to make this stuff up. It's much easier. My peers are having a much easier time just actually working with their real memory, the things they actually did like. And so I have to drop, So, you can't, just say, let me just see. Do I have a memory and stuff? And I guarantee you do. I mean, I had another student that said, I don't remember anything. I really don't have any memories. My memory's never been any good, so I don't remember anything. So I first question said, well, did you ever go on vacation with your parents? Yeah. Oh, yeah, well, to the Bahamas, and I almost got eaten by a shark. All this stuff came up. Like, you have a memory. Just dog little. So I think it can be done, superficially. I mean, it can be done in a workshop. Go through those steps. I mean, it's not fancy. There's a lot of theory behind it. There's a lot of other accounts. It's certainly supported by neuroaesthetics as well. So there's a lot of reasons why, our memory works this way. It holds together. And I think what's interesting about electricity is that our memory, electricity as an apparatus is becoming more like how memory actually works. Memory doesn't work. Human memory, supported and augmented by the whole institution, has this associative network kind of quality. And that's what I think Maestri gets at. It shows you that you occupy this rather aesthetic pattern. It's really a pattern. And you find that pattern, hither and yon, it allows you to make connections that you intuit. The hard part is there's still the verification side, right? There's the discovery side. And most creators will tell you that, they know intuitively some pretty profound insight. It takes them 20 years to prove it. But
in terms of your sort of grand theory of moving from literacy to electracy, what's been interesting to me is you put it back in the Industrial Revolution, and the computational is sort of just a part of an unfolding tendency. And you mentioned sort of Freud is one of the first thinkers who begins to identify this sort of shift of being. Would you say he's somebody who alerts us to these other areas of human cognition that's been excluded? Is he the important figure?
Yeah, he's a very important figure. He's kind of like the Kepler of electricity, you might say. I mean, I mentioned that in that context because I was saying, Kepler, like he's an alchemist. I mean, he's believes in astrology. He's very hermetic things, but he's also making these verification principles, and he's works out his very careful empirical observations and does real new science. but he's motivated by this other part of his imagination. Freud's very like that. So we say, on one hand, Freud is a positivist. I mean, he's a medical doctor. He's addressing suffering, human suffering that can't be accounted for in physiological ways. Phenomena of hysteria and so on is being studied by other people. And so he reaches into these other resources, and so he brings back in a positivist, empirical kind of scientific community. If you know the latter 19th century was, science is no longer that way, but I mean, it certainly was then, and the heightened period of enlightenment. He says, well, let's look at all this stuff that got shoved into the attic. Dreams, jokes, mythology, folklore, mistakes, and so forth. Let's bring all that back into science. So he brings it into the back door. He brings back in the humanities. He brings back in the arts. Says this is all relevant to empirical questions, certainly questions of understanding human suffering and unhappiness. So he's this kind of transitional figure. Now, in contemporary post-structural theory, is still very interested in Freud and psychoanalysis. We're not interested in the empirical part, the clinical part. I mean, certainly, psychoanalysis still has a role to play in therapy, but that's not why it's important from the point of view of electricity. But rather, it describes, it's the most systematic description that we have of this alternative logic, this alternative to propositional kinds of logic or symbolic logics, powerful as they are, leave out this other, like we say, this affective, emotional, libidinal dimension of human power and cause. So Freud's really a crucial figure in that way. So just in terms of theory, of course you've mentioned the avant-garde. The other thing that's going on at the time is within the whole bourgeois civilization, immediately emerges this Bohemia in Paris, and developed this cabaret scene in Montmartre where the vices were brought into entertainment, and that's where the avant-garde was created, and that's where they, created, ultimately Dadaism comes out of that. As a kind of satirical, thumbing of the nose at the whole Renaissance Enlightenment traditions. That's a major source as well. But you mentioned, as I say, that it's the Industrial Revolutions when the electricity begins. That Kant is probably, we might say, is the transitional figure. At the end of the Enlightenment, the end of the 18th century, introduces the three critiques that are that constitute an account of theopraxis there with his three critiques. But he introduces taste. He introduces aesthetics as a new capacity equal to practical reason and theoretical pure reason, and that's new. And that's a new move epistemologically, in ontology, and aesthetics is at the very core of electrate metaphysics. So that kind of philosophical dimension is equally important. But we should also say, and it's sort of misunderstood, but part of the invention then is the whole, the bourgeois revolution. The invention of the bourgeoisie in terms of capitalism. I mean, electricity is emerging within the corporate system of entertainment. And this is part of what we want to kind of know. Electricity doesn't do analytical science better than literacy did. Literacy is adapting to electricity. Science is adapting to computing, obviously. That's all happening, just like religion or morality adapted to the book. That's all happening. But there's this other dimension that where electricity is really happening in this terms of human well-being, of the satisfaction of individual people, organized institutionally in corporations and fostering entertainment. I mean, that's the site of that electricity is emerging, becoming powerful. And part of that invention is the commodity form. I mean, the commodity form, much criticized, obviously critiqued for good reason, by all the theorists and everything, the tenured radicals, as they say. Much critique because the commodity form it's got a downside, but the upside is that it's a rule of transformation. As anything can be exchanged for anything else. It's a rule of exchange, and that rule of exchange is fundamentally a rule of communication, and it kind of freed up the whole signifier world from the limitations and restrictions of empirical reality. And that's where surrealism comes in. So it's like, in our science systems, anything can be anything. Anything can be anything else. And that's a different kind of a world. It's not a world that you can tell true from false, but rather it's a world of imagination and dream, deception, lie, all those things go on, fraud, identity theft. You can speak from experience. And that's a new order, and it's a new kind of space-time undergoing, and it's still being invented. But this is where we say it's not rational, and it's way beyond. So we're saying, right, rationality exists, but it's not everything. It's not the limit. It doesn't account for the kind of world that we have. So that's where we start looking and taking very seriously, looking at, Dadaism as the avant-garde, Freudian dream work as the logic. So those things have already been invented. Some of my colleagues are like still waiting. It's like the Messiah, electricity is still going to come. We haven't, we must push on to the next, the next new thing. But I always love that thing they tell you in airlines. You get on there and there's all these safety things, and they say, remember that the nearest exit may be behind you. And that's really true about the invention of the apparatus. It is these major inventions of the logic and the metaphysics, they've already been invented in principle, and now it's a matter of their developing or augmenting. All of the little details are still being worked through, so still a work in progress. But we look to these other alternative kind of modalities. I would say the biggest issue, and this comes back something to Mark that I'm reminded of that I know was important to you when we first talked about this. It reminds me that one of the important parts about Maestri as a pedagogy and the wide image is that it says to you, you look at MIT, and you look at the student body of MIT, and I think, I saw a read somewhere, somebody, maybe you told me, or I saw some propaganda leaflet, but anyway, MIT is like, probably the top university internationally in the world in terms of its role and commitment to international education, in terms of students coming from all over the world to study at MIT. And the thing is, with literacy, it was sort of one size fits all. There's a certain model of, verbal, analytical numeracy that was kind of like the model of learning. There was a certain Western model of experience that was promoted, whether it was probably European originally. But that's not the way literacy is. Literacy is particularized, it's singularized. Like we say, Maestri comes after herstory, meaning that there is no general, there is no ideal, there is no universal configuration, or there is in this narrow literate model, but this broader frame is that as we turn to our home ground, and that we look back to our heritage, we look back to our traditions, we look back to our family as resources wherever we came from, Eastern Europe, Turkey, China, Korea, that those are the resources that we want to bring into our thinking process so they're not running around. I sort of think of people that don't do that as sort of like having, trying to play, golf or something with one hand tied behind their backs, or, they're in a bag race, they only got, allowed to hop on one leg. You have to draw upon your whole background experience, that whole pop cycle, like I said, draw in upon that, bring that as a resource to get, and I think what it really gets at, I mentioned the fusion engine of creativity. One of the mysteries of creativity is why do creative, productive people stay with a problem far after others have dropped it? The more empirical, superficial, I need to get a grant kind of a people, like they look at a problem, oh, that's interesting, they work 6 months on it, forget about it, right? But the inventors are those who are fascinated. There's something that's fascinated there, and it's really not about the problem as such, but it's about the kind of experience they're having, that there's a match in that problem with their intuitive disposition about how they want the world to be. And they stick with it, and they'll stick with it for 10, 20 years, and they do some work and say, oh, it gets the Nobel Prize. Now, one of the things I used to say to my students when I introduced Maestri was I'd tell a story and I would say, now, a lot of the people that have been studying this way got Nobel Prizes, and when you are giving your Nobel Prize acceptance speech, I want, credit. Ulmer, his wide image, without that, I'd still be a bozo. Yeah, but none of the students have gotten a Nobel Prize yet, so I don't know. I don't know what's wrong. Maybe some of you guys.
One last one for my benefit. Kant's three critiques. You've got such an amazing knowledge here, but to have that context as we try to introduce this term is useful,
Right.
at least to me.
Right. Well, just to say, all the way back to Aristotle, the idea was that human capacity. Aristotle said, there's addressing what is necessary, and let's say, that's pure reason, and that's addresses understanding. So you figure out how the world works, really in that sense of physics. The laws of growth, the materiality of the world, what's necessary, and then. And that could take you up all the way to deal with everything in the world except the human being. Because the problem with the human being, Aristotle said, in figuring out whether there can be a science that addresses, the human world, is problematic. Because when you get into what happens with humans, is human decision making is involved. So should we go to war, with Sparta, or should we go to war with Ukraine or something? That's a decision which could go either way. There's no right answer. There's no necessity to it. There's no determinism to it because human decision making is involved. So that decision making you call practical reason, and it involves ethics, it involves politics. You have to have a polis. You have to have a community. And there's no necessity to it. Like there's chance involved. So that's the second kind of reason. There's pure reason. There's practical reason. And that sort of was the account of it. And what was called productivity, the model of making stuff, polices, was kind of, all right, that's real, but it's not like at the same level of capacity. You use your other skills, your reasoning powers to, build a table or design a building, but it wasn't considered to be one of the fundamental capacities. Poiesis was not until Kant. So the importance of Kant is he adds a third critique, because what he had said is, right, you've got necessity, which is like pure reason that says, all right, the world, everybody's going to die, or, gravity or whatever. These are the laws of nature. Stars move in a certain way. But there's this other thing, all right, practical reason, which Kant identified with moral freedom. So even though there is a certain necessity, human beings are free to decide to behave in a way other than against those laws of necessity. And he had this idea of a categorical imperative, which is to say, make the rule of your own behavior the rule for everybody in the world. And that, if you want everybody to behave this way, if you want everybody to cheat and lie, okay, then that's going to have to, then okay, so be it. But, he didn't, being an Enlightenment figure, he didn't think that people would, want to make the moral rule of the whole world to be, fraud. Of course, Diderot, thought otherwise with, the Rameau's nephew. but Kant's idea was, all right, you've got pure, you've got the necessity, and then you've got ethical freedom. How do the two get together? This was the big mystery. Like how do you put moral freedom into the world of necessity? And his answer was the third critique. And he said, all right, human beings have another dimension that is a capacity which is just as much, has to be promoted to the same level of originality as these other two. And he thought that his purpose, and this was the capacity for beauty, that human beings have taste. They have judgment of beauty, which enables them to experience and of course create works of order. And he thought that this experience of beauty especially happened in the imagination when all the capacities, of necessity, understanding, of moral freedom, of decision, and then this experience of beauty, when they're all working together, theopraxesis, that's when we feel satisfaction. That's when we feel harmony. Whatever, even if we're frustrated, even if we're resisted in our projects, that if we have that experience in our undergoing of the world, that we are happy, we're capable of satisfaction. And that was the big mystery for Aristotle. He couldn't figure out, he said he knew, he got to these pure concepts where he could say, look, I know that the good of humanity is happiness. But he said happiness has to be created in the polis, and I don't know how you do that. So just like, all right, just go contemplate, the heavens or something. That's the best you can do to be happy. That was sort of withdrawal of the sages. But Kant says, no, you've got to be out in the world. And he thought that the third critique, this capacity for beauty, could moderate, mediate between a pure and practical reason. And Hannah Arendt is the big champion of that position. She really feels, after the Holocaust and after Eichmann and so on, she said, look, the one hope that we have as a world community is that we get control of the way we appear in the world. That is, we bring beauty into as a kind of model for how ethics can work. That we want the world to have this kind of sense of the qualities of the judgments of beauty, or perhaps of the sublime. Kant would say, people would say after Kant, that beauty doesn't account for the modern world, but the sublime does. But there was this idea of these three kinds of intelligence. What is necessary? The moral freedom is an act of will, and then there's this experience of beauty, or even of the sublime, that mediates between the two. So all three go together, and the challenge of the electrate, invention of electrate metaphysics is to work out, I call it theopraxesis, a way to make them happen together. But the ways of doing that are institutional. They have to be invented. They don't just happen in the abstract or in some philosophy class. There have to be political systems. There have to be ways, of the habitus of raising children. There have to be, ways that the corporation manages its influence on policies. That have to, undertake the realization or implementation of a theopraxesis. Our metaphysics says it's possible, and our judgment says it's necessary. So now but it has to be invented. That's the history of the apparatus. It doesn't happen by itself. Don't wait around, for somebody else to do it. It has to be invented.
What a fantastic note to end on. I thank you so much for your input. It's been really great.
We will communicate further.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I'll catch up with you. Thank you.
Okay, take care, man.